Hello, everybody. It's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you an example and a little bit of some ideas when it comes to this upcoming essay task that we have. We won't do the essay until we get back from break, so it'll be an in-class essay. The question will be very similar to the question that you have, maybe a little bit different, but generally a similar question. So what you're looking to do for Tuesday is prepare some notes that enable you to consider some of the question. And the notes preparation is more than just a task of reading. You're really looking to not only pull some information from your sources, but really focus on organizing some of the information so that you can use it. That's where historical context comes in. So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit better. I have three tips for you here, and I use the Rutgers Department of History website to kind of help organize some of these tips, just to outline good historical writing, not necessarily only for the purpose of the IB exam, but just in general, what is really good historical writing. The first tip is really understanding the question that's being asked. I think we get a sense of that, that there are these different requests and demands within the question. And in the case of the compare and contrast question for the IB exam, we know that we have a very particular demand for the question. You are looking at the effects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So you want your essay to really focus more on the effects and the aftermath of the treaty. You might have some initial context, say in an introduction, about the Mexican-American War and about the treaty terms. So that might be interesting to have, but your essay is not really about the development of the treaty or about, Santa Anna fighting, against U.S. forces or anything like that. You're really looking at the aftermath of the treaty. And you're looking at this in terms of how it affects national identities. That element kind of adds a little bit more abstraction to this question. And what you're looking at, even if you consider, political, economic, social effects, you're really looking at how does this impact, to some degree, the identity in terms of like confidence and maybe a country that kind of is able to, escalate its own status, or a country that becomes more vulnerable, more challenged in some ways, more humiliated in some ways. And I think you kind of have a sense of how that could relate to both the United States and Mexico. So what kind of shapes these national identities, and in the case of both of these countries, there's also, different ways to argue national identity. So think about that. For example, in the United States, there could certainly be a degree of increased confidence, and that can come from a variety of things that you put your finger on in terms of political or economic or social. But there also might be some hypocrisy in the way the United States, is after certain expansionism or the degree of racism that occurs. So you can look at national identities through a few different lenses. That's something that, will ultimately kind of coalesce into your thesis. So when you're thinking about national identities, you're almost looking at, kind of the status of the countries, the way they may see themselves, or the way, relative to the past, or the way in which they may see themselves, relative to other countries. You can connect, things like the Monroe Doctrine to this. You also can, and I'll just kind of enable a little bit of a bit of latitude at the end of the question. The question states, between the Mexican War and the end of the U.S. Civil War. So you're kind of looking at the immediate aftermath in the decades following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and most of the sources you have do address that. If you wanted to build a paragraph that talks about some of the long-term legacy of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that's totally fine. So if you want to kind of entertain a question that enables you to go further than the U.S. Civil War, that's totally fine and actually gets gets you into some historical context that might give you greater knowledge. So there's some advantages to doing that. So I'll leave that up to you. In terms of historical writing, this is just some things to think about. Writing in history is, going to be very connected to the sources that you're looking at. You're pulling evidence that helps you build an argument. But in the way that you write in history, you really do need to consider putting your arguments, in a time and place. So when students write without acknowledging time and place, it becomes, something where historical context could be lacking. Historians are particularly sensitive to errors of anachronism, kind of having things that maybe have no concept of chronology, having historical characters, think or, argue something that maybe would be, inappropriate for what they actually believed. So historical context is all about your ability to work with the evidence in your voice and help your reader understand the significance of your evidence. So your evidence may say something, but the way you make a case to use that evidence must consider historical context. And this is really a key thing to find in historical writing. So I'm going to kind of give you an example, just based on things that I might have seen or heard, in the fishbowl or things like that. Some things that are broad kind of statements, things that you might want to look to avoid would be statements like the Monroe Doctrine was about expansionism, as the intent the administration of President Monroe placed at the time was focused on land grabbing throughout Latin America. This is a statement that kind of says the Monroe Doctrine was about expansionism because the administration placed a priority on expansionism. There's little in the statement about what is meant by Latin America. There's no examples used. There's kind of this like very, very broad statement that really lacks historical context, okay? Any specific evidence is also lacking. If you look at the next statement, okay, so this is maybe a little bit better. President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams clearly intended the 1823 Monroe Doctrine to be about expansionism, as there was a precedent of expansionism in the actions of the administration. Okay, so we now have, actors, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. This adds some context because now your reader knows that you know a little bit about the way the Monroe Doctrine went down. There's also an argument in here and some kind of specific description of an argument that could use some support that there was precedent of expansionism. A case in point is the U.S. treaty to acquire Florida from Spain in 1919. So in this case, the student is using an example, right? So this is now an argument. It's not only that it was about expansionism. I know it was about expansionism because the Monroe administration acted, 4 years before, and they grabbed Florida, right? And this was, an example. So the reader, for example, of this would know, all right, the student knows enough to kind of put in the example of Florida. Florida fits here as precedent of expansionism. So the argument is a good one, but it lacks some historical context, okay? So what would be better still? President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams clearly intended the 1823 Monroe Doctrine to be about expansionism, as there was precedent as early as 1819 when the Monroe administration acquired Florida from Spain. In this case, a military occupation under Andrew Jackson led to an extended conflict with the Seminole tribe. The aggressive military action forced a treaty with Spain, which was weakened at the time by the Peninsular Campaign under Napoleon. Jackson's military campaign in Florida was controversial, but supported by Secretary of State Adams, who argued it was necessary. Spain was unable to control conflict in Florida. Under a pressured treaty with Spanish diplomat Onís, Adams permanently acquired East and West Florida for the U.S. This action suggested the Monroe administration placed a value on expansion. At the time, the U.S. also pledged to recognize the territory of Texas as part of Mexico, and this was later disregarded. while the Monroe Doctrine did use language that supports anti-colonialism, the example of Florida offers insight into the actions of the administration. In this case, historical context is helping to shape the evidence. This is not an essay that just has description where the essay is listing. One example is, the example of Florida, and another example is the Texas annexation crisis, and another example is this. The evidence is used to make a specific point about the way the Monroe Doctrine was shaped, okay, and what its intent was, which is what the student is trying to maintain, okay? The very last thing I'm going to note here is just some emphasis on preparing the material. How do you write an essay that has and includes some of that historical context, right? It is created by reading, right? So a lot of historical writing, comes from the way that you shape some of the evidence you read. Your ability to do that is strengthened when you have good, solid knowledge about a topic. So, watching some of your work in class, my thinking is one of the best ways to kind of enable you to better use evidence is to spend a little bit of time, reading and thinking about some of the background information, almost in a textbooky kind of way, because then as you read and reread some of the sources that pose particular arguments, say, for example, an excerpt from Greg Grandin, you can work with that information and connect it to historical context a little bit better. So when you're reading sources, my first tip for you is to really do a strong reading of the materials, kind of find yourself in a quiet place with a little bit of time and with a pen in your hand. Either print out the sources and annotate them, organize a space on a Google Doc where you're going to put notes by source, or have a space in your notebook that's kind of dedicated to source specific notes, and then work to develop your table. So in this case, your compare and contrast table is something where you're taking information from sources you've already read and taken notes on and working with some of that content to help shape how you might use it to really think. So this requires a couple of different steps. One of the steps is really good reading of the sources. You can't casually read a source and then know it. So you really have to work with the source to build for yourself what the author is arguing. That takes a lot of time and attention, especially with difficult readings. And that's something that, can really only be acquired by you. That degree of knowledge building is part of learning content from sources, and, is like kind of, the background source, the historical context. I just always refer to as base. So as you're reading more and more sources and you kind of expose yourself to base, to the basic kind of chronology about a particular event, you can kind of continually work off the same base. But I think in your, kind of beginnings in IB history, working some more with some of those base sources could be very helpful for your writing. So think of this as like a process of doing jumping jacks. And before you read the sources that were assigned, spend some time looking at the topic of manifest destiny, looking at the topic of the American West. And also, I'll post some information, a background video from Mexico. I think a lot of it is in that Latin American history source, so I think that is to some degree a little bit of base. But the American Yawp, we looked at that source in class. There's a section on manifest destiny and a section that is on the West. So look at those two sections. The Manifest Destiny source is very good for helping you with the time period of the 1840s, which is the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, into the 1850s, for information that takes place a little bit later, even post Civil War. look at the section about the West. I'll post Brinkley chapters about Manifest Destiny and also about Western expansion. Some of you have an interest in focusing on the topic of racism, the topics of what happened to Chinese immigration, looking at the land rights that indigenous peoples had. So that's a source that can give you specific context. You don't necessarily need context in everything, but you need context in the areas where you're going to be talking about. If you're focusing on the rise of the American Civil War, then you would need context about that. Okay, so depending on the thesis that you create, you really want context on those specific things. There's also a great documentary that Ken Burns did. It's on YouTube. It's called The West. I encourage you to look for that if you are a documentary person. Okay, cite all your sources and use some of these background sources in the content that you place in your graphic organizer. Okay, be well. If you have questions,